One morning, two teenage girls accepted a ride from a police officer thinking that he was taking them to the beach. However, he had other plans for them and took them somewhere else instead. Hello, my name's Alyssa, and welcome to the Fear and Humanity channel. If you're dark, twisted, like true crime, and all things spooky, then you found your new home. All right, are you ready to hear about Florida's first known serial killer? Well, come with me and I'll tell you about it. On July 21st, 1972, 17-year-old Pamela Wells and 18-year-old Nancy Totter were hitchhiking on their way to the beach when a police officer pulled up next to them. He seemed pretty nice, but he started telling them about how hitchhiking was illegal in the state of Florida and that they were really lucky it was him that pulled them over and not some other strict officer. Now that he's educated them on the laws and to help them out even more, he offers them a ride home, which they accept. On the way to the girls' home, he offered them a ride the next morning to the beach so they wouldn't get in trouble by anybody else. And they had no reason not to accept. So they did. The next morning, the officer showed up at the girls' home and picked them up, and on the way to the beach, he said that he wanted to stop and show them some Spanish fort that he found out in the swamp. And before the girls even got a chance to answer, he pulled down the gravel road. This is when this once nice guy officer that these two girls had met the day before was now starting to ask them some sexual questions and making them feel extremely uncomfortable. And at this point, they asked him if he would turn around. Instead, he came to a stop, turned around, pointed a gun at the girls, and said to them, "I'm going to sell you into white slavery and a prostitution ring." He then got out, went to the back door, let them out one by one, and handcuffed each of them behind their backs. Then he took a noose and tied one around each girl's neck. He guided them with his gun to two tree stumps and had both girls stand on each of them. He then took the ends of their nooses and tied it around the limb of a tree. Now these girls were completely helpless. If they made any kind of movement or fell off, it would have hung them. The officer seemed to extremely get off on this and went up and started sexually assaulting each girl. All of a sudden, the radio from his cruiser goes off, and it's the dispatcher shouting his name. The deputy then turns to the two girls, smiles at them, and says, "Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back," and then creepily gets into his car and drives off. And this is because that son of a bitch was on duty at the time. The girls watched him drive down the road and off into the distance and began trying to figure out their escape plan. Nancy was able to get the rope around her neck a little loose to where she could wiggle her head out, and then she went over to help her friend out. Now free from their nooses, but still handcuffed behind their backs, the girls decide to go their separate ways and split up and see if they can find help. One of them was able to make it back to the highway, and they were able to flag down a vehicle, and it just so happened to be a sheriff. This sheriff saw that the woman was distressed, and he stopped, and he about shit his pants when he heard his own deputy's name come out of the young woman's mouth. It was Deputy Schaefer, Deputy Gerard Schaefer. Gerard John Schaefer was born on March 25th, 1946, in Wisconsin to couple Doris and Gerard Schaefer, and he was the first of three children. Gerard was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, where he attended the Marist Academy until his family up and moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 1960. At the ripe age of 12 years old, he began experimenting with women's clothes and bondage. Later, he stated that he used to get off by tying himself to trees, hurting himself, or thinking about mutilating or killing women. He also went on to say that it was his father's fault that he ended up experimenting with all of these things because his father worked all of the time, and when he would come home, he would spend more time with Gerard's sister than Gerard. So his dad made him want to mutilate women. Into his teenage years, he didn't know how else to get off besides going and looking through girls' windows, especially a young girl by the name of Lee Bonadise. Now, remember this name for later on. According to Gerard, in 1966, when he was 20 years old, he did try to get psychiatric help for his unhealthy homicidal sexual fantasies. However, it didn't help, and he then started hearing voices. At this point, he turned to religion and joined a Catholic singing group and toured the South with them. This is when he thought that he found his calling at being a priest. However, the St. John Seminary denied him for the priesthood because he didn't have enough faith. This then pissed Gerard off, and he just up and quit the church at that point. His next career choice was to try to become a teacher. That way, he could teach all of the nation's youth American values, including purity, honesty, unselfishness, and love. He ended up getting fired because he kept getting in trouble for shoving his beliefs down the children's throats. So, let's not do that, okay? Okay. In 1968, Gerard married a woman by the name of Martha Fogg. The marriage didn't last for very long, only about a year and a half, because on May of 1970, Martha filed for divorce for extreme cruelty. To deal with the emotions he was feeling from his failed marriage, Gerard decided to take a trip to Europe. He was gone for a few months, and by the time he got back, he had a brand new attitude and a brand new career choice: law enforcement. I mean, he just keeps picking all of these career choices to where he's like in charge or people have to look up to him and shit. It's kind of disgusting. Like, I understand if like you want to be a good person and all, but like, he's not that. Mm-mm. He began his law enforcement career as a security guard at an establishment where he met his second wife, Teresa Dean. Now, this marriage was unlike his first one because Teresa was later quoted saying that he was a very kind and gentle husband. After the two were married, Gerard began applying to all of the different departments at his local police station. However, he was denied for them because he failed the psychological exam. The next county over ignored this and hired him anyways. However, this job only lasted for a few months and he was fired for unknown reasons. That's all right though. He already had another law enforcement job lined up down in Stuart, Florida at the police department. And this was the police department that he was working for when he took those two girls and kidnapped them. So, come back to the beginning of the story. When Gerard got back to the site where he had left the girls, he began shitting his pants when he saw that they were no longer there. So much so that he left the area, went to the nearest phone that he could find, and called his sheriff. When his sheriff answered, Gerard said, "I've done something foolish. You're going to be so mad at me." Gerard went on to explain that he just kind of overdid his job a little bit, that he was just trying to show the girls the dangers of hitchhiking and what could really happen to them if an actual bad guy were to stop and pick them up. Right. The sheriff also saw through Gerard's bullshit and fired him, and then also had him brought into custody that day. He was charged with 2 counts of assault and false imprisonment. He was let out on bail in September of 72 and had to come back for his hearing in November. At this hearing, he pled guilty to one of the assault charges, and all of the other charges were dropped. He was sentenced to 1 year in county jail and was set to start his sentence on January 16th of 1973. Meanwhile, another case was coming to surface of 2 missing teenage girls. 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup were last seen in Fort Lauderdale on September 12th of 72 at Susan's mother's house. She said that the girls were going to the beach to play guitar with a man that they met named Jerry Shepard. It's a little close to somebody else's name, you know. I think so too. I think you're right. Jerry drove a blue-green Datsun, and the mother even wrote down the guy's license plate. She pretty much immediately reported the girls missing when they didn't come home. The police thought, these are just some teenage girls out having fun. Let's not even worry about it. So that's what they did. On April 1st, 1973, 3 men were out on Hutchison Island looking for aluminum cans when they came across 2 sets of skeletal remains. Dental records proved that these were the remains of teenagers Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. This is when the police took it a little bit more seriously and decided to take the license plate number that Susan's mother had written down and trace it back to Jerry Shepard, aka Gerard Schaefer. It's the same guy. And they figured it out. Since the bodies were clearly way too far in the decaying process, they weren't able to determine a cause of death for either of the girls, although they were able to see that Susan was shot in the jaw. On April 7th, a search warrant was issued for Gerard's mother's house. And when police went there and started looking through things, they ended up finding a whole-ass collection of Gerard's. Among the items, investigators found tons of women's jewelry, over 100 sketches drawn by Gerard of the mutilation, torture, and murder of women, the newspaper clippings of missing girls, and 2 IDs of missing women. The 2 IDs belonged to Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox. The 2 were last seen a week prior to Gerard's original arrest back in July of 72. The remains were found in 1977, but no cause of death was ever determined, and no one was ever held responsible for their deaths. All of the newspaper clippings were from the year 1969, and they were of multiple missing women. One of the women was 22-year-old Carmen Halleck. Now, Carmen actually dated Gerard, and she was abducted from her home in February of 1969 and was never seen again. He also had some of her jewelry as well. Oh, and a gold tooth filling of hers. And we know this because her dentist said that it was. He confirmed it. Another one of the newspaper clippings was of 25-year-old Lee Bonadies. You remember that name, don't you? She's the young girl from the beginning that when Gerard was a teenager, he used to stare at her through her windows and get off that way because he was a fucking creep. He also had some of her jewelry as well. And Lee's brother stated that the last thing that she had said to him before she went missing in October of 69 was that she was offered a top secret job by the government by a man and was going to take it. Her remains were found in 1978, but no cause of death was ever determined, and no one was ever held responsible for her death. Some of the other jewelry that was found was tracked back to belong to 14-year-old Mary Miscalina and 13-year-old Elsie Farmer. Both of these girls went missing in October of 1972, and their remains were found early in January of 1973. However, no cause of death was ever determined, and no one was ever held responsible for their deaths. On May 18, 1973, Gerard John Schaefer was convicted of 2 murders in the first degree. He was charged for the murders of teenagers Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. He was given 2 life sentences consecutively. Over the span of his prison life, he attempted to appeal his conviction over 20 times, but was denied every single time. In 1990, Gerard wrote a book called Killer Fiction while he was in prison. He also had his girlfriend from high school named Sandra London publish it for him. Killer Fiction consists of about 30 short stories of what Gerard calls his art. I call it fucking gross because I read some of it, and really it's just a bunch of his nasty ass fantasies about mutilating, torturing, raping, and murdering women. And what I actually think is that it might have been based on real events of some of the victims that he may have had. And investigators also believed this. And on April 9th, 1991, Gerard wrote a letter about one of his stories called Murder Demons, which kind of goes along with the theory of what police were thinking. This letter said,
"What crimes am I supposed to confess? Farmer? Biscalina? What do you think Murder Demons is about? You want confessions, but don't recognize them when I anoint you with them, and we've just gotten started."
And then another one later stating,
"As you know, I've always harped on Robert Stone's list of 34. In 1973, I sat down and drew up a list of my own. As I can recall, my list was just over 80. I'm not claiming a huge number. I would say it runs between 80 and 110. But over 8 years and 3 continents, one whore drowned in her own vomit while watching me disembowel her girlfriend. I'm not sure that counts as a valid kill. Did the pregnant ones count as 2 kills? It can get confusing."
Gerard John Schaefer died at the age of 49 on December 3rd, 1995. He died brutally by fellow inmate Vincent Rivera. Rivera never admitted to why he did it, but it was kind of a known thing that Gerard was a snitch in the prison. And like I said, he died brutally, with the fatal blows being to each one of his eye sockets with a shank and then his throat being slit. Susan Place's mother thought that Gerard being murdered like this was finally justice for her daughter that was long overdue. Now, on the other hand, some of the family members of the potential victims of Gerard Schaefer didn't feel the same way. They thought that now they're never going to figure out what happened to their loved ones. Here's a list of all of the known victims and potential victims of Gerard John Schaefer. Thank you for watching our first long video that we've ever uploaded. If you like what you see, go ahead and prove it. Prove it to me and like this video, please. And thank you. If you're interested in seeing more stories like this, go ahead and follow us and hit that notification button so you'll know whenever we do post more things. You can also follow us on all social media platforms under the name fearinhumanity. Thanks again for watching, and remember, please, always keep an eye out for bad guys. Okay, ta-ta for now.